Before the story begins, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more emotional and surprising stories ahead. And now let's dive into today's story. The day my granddaughter told me I was no longer allowed to visit, I knew something in my family had changed in a way no one wanted to explain. It was a quiet Sunday morning in Ohio, the kind where the air feels still and the light comes through the kitchen window in soft lines across the table. I was standing by the sink, holding a mug of coffee that had gone cold without me noticing, when my phone rang. It was my granddaughter Olivia, her voice unusually careful, almost rehearsed. "Grandma, Mom said it's better if you don't come this weekend." There was no anger in her tone, no emotion at all, just a flat sentence that didn't match the child I remembered running into my arms not long ago. I didn't respond right away. I just sat down at the table, my hand still wrapped around the mug, as if moving too quickly might break something I couldn't fix. "Did I do something wrong?" I asked gently, though I already felt the answer wasn't going to make sense. Olivia hesitated, then said, "I don't know. Mom just said we're busy." And then the line went silent. I stayed there long after the call ended, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, trying to understand how busy had become a reason I was no longer part of their lives. My son Michael used to call me every week without fail, but lately the calls had become shorter, distracted, always ending with, "Talk to Samantha about scheduling." Samantha, my daughter-in-law, had always been polite in a distant way, but over the past year that distance had grown into something more structured, like invisible walls carefully placed between me and my own family. I began noticing small things first, things I almost convinced myself were misunderstandings. Messages left unanswered for days, visits postponed and never rescheduled, photographs from family gatherings where I no longer appeared, even when I knew I had been invited before. One evening I saw a picture posted online of Olivia and Ethan decorating cookies at Samantha's house, all smiles, flour on their hands, matching aprons tied neatly at their waists. I had been told that day they were too tired for visitors. I remember staring at that image longer than I should have, trying to find a logical explanation that didn't hurt. When I brought it up to Michael later that week, he sounded tired, almost defensive. "Mom, things are just complicated right now. Samantha is handling the kids' schedules, just go through her." That sentence stayed with me longer than I expected because it didn't sound like coordination anymore, it sounded like permission. And slowly, without anyone ever directly telling me, I started to realize I was waiting for invitations that were no longer coming. Still, I told myself families go through phases, that children grow busy, that silence doesn't always mean exclusion. But deep down, in the quiet moments when I sat alone at my kitchen table, I felt something shifting that I couldn't name yet, as if I were standing outside a door that had quietly been locked from the other side. And I was the only one who hadn't been told. The days that followed felt heavier, not because anything had changed on the surface, but because I could no longer ignore the pattern forming in front of me. I tried calling Olivia again 2 days later, telling myself I was being sensitive, that children sometimes say things without understanding how they sound. She answered on the third ring, but her voice was different, more cautious, as if someone else was nearby listening. I asked her how school was going, how Ethan was doing with his reading, and she gave short answers, each one followed by a pause that felt too intentional to be natural. When I asked if we could plan a visit next week, there was a long silence before she said she would have to ask her mom. Not her father. Not our family. Her mom. That word stayed with me after the call ended. I sat in my living room that afternoon staring at the framed photos on the shelf, trying to remember when exactly things had shifted. Michael used to bring the children over on Saturday mornings without needing to check with anyone. We would bake pancakes and Olivia would stand on a stool helping me stir the batter while Ethan spilled more flour on the counter than he ever managed to keep in the bowl. Now even a simple visit required approval that never seemed to come. A few days later I saw another photograph online. It was taken at what looked like a small family gathering, balloons in the background, a dinner table arranged neatly in a backyard I recognized immediately as Samantha's home. Olivia and Ethan were there again, smiling, standing close to their mother and my son, holding matching cups as if they had just finished a celebration. I stared at that image for a long time because I had been told that evening was not a good time for visitors. I remember the exact message Michael had sent me. "It is a quiet night, maybe next time." But there they were, laughing under warm string lights, as if the night had never been quiet at all. When I brought it up gently during a phone call with Michael, I could hear him exhale before he spoke, like he had been expecting the question. He told me Samantha had organized something last minute for the children, something simple, nothing intentional. His voice sounded tired in a way I had not heard before, like he was constantly choosing the easiest answer instead of the truthful one. I asked him why I was not invited, and there was another pause, longer this time, followed by the same phrase I had started to hear too often. "It is complicated, Mom. Samantha is managing everything with the kids right now. It is easier this way." Easier for who, I wanted to ask, but I did not. Instead I said I understood because that is what I had always done. I made things easier for other people by not asking questions that might make them uncomfortable. But after that call I could not sleep the same way anymore. I would lie in bed listening to the house settle around me, thinking about how quickly later had replaced now in my family's life. Even small things began to feel like evidence I could not ignore. A birthday card that never arrived on time. A school recital I only learned about after it had already happened. A video clip posted online where Ethan ran into Samantha's arms after a school event, while I had been told he was too busy that week for phone calls. I started writing things down in a notebook without telling anyone. Dates, messages, conversations, small contradictions that I could not make sense of. Not because I wanted to accuse anyone, but because I needed to understand whether I was imagining the distance or if it was really being built piece by piece in front of me. And the more I wrote, the clearer it became that I was no longer part of the space where decisions were being made about the children I had once held every day. I began noticing that the silence around my grandchildren was no longer accidental but structured, almost as if every moment of contact was being filtered through someone else before it ever reached me. One afternoon I tried calling Ethan directly, hoping that a child's voice would feel more open, more honest, but the call never connected the way it used to. Instead, it went straight to voicemail, and later that evening I received a short message from Michael saying that the children's devices were being managed more carefully now for better routines. That phrase did not sound like something he had ever said before. It sounded rehearsed, like it had been chosen for him. A few days later I drove past Samantha's neighborhood without planning to, telling myself I was just running errands, but I slowed down when I saw Olivia and Ethan outside their house with their backpacks, standing near the driveway as if waiting for a ride. I pulled over a short distance away, not close enough to interrupt, just close enough to watch. I raised my hand to wave, but before I could, I saw Samantha step out of the house. She said something to them, not loudly, but firmly enough that both children turned away from the street almost immediately. Olivia glanced around as if she had heard something she was not supposed to respond to, then quickly looked down at her shoes. Ethan followed without hesitation. There was no smile, no recognition, just movement as if a signal had been given. I sat in my car long after they disappeared into the house, trying to understand what I had just seen, because it did not look like distance anymore. It looked like instruction. That evening I asked Michael about it directly, keeping my voice as calm as I could manage. I told him I had been nearby and had seen the children, that I would have liked to say hello. There was a long pause before he responded, and when he did, his tone carried a weight that felt heavier than the words themselves. He said Samantha preferred to keep routines consistent for the children during the week, that unexpected visits or interactions sometimes disrupted their focus. I remember gripping the phone tighter, because nothing about what I had seen felt like disruption. It felt like avoidance. When I mentioned that Olivia had not even looked at me, there was another pause, shorter this time, followed by Michael saying that children sometimes get shy when they are in structured environments. But I had raised Olivia. I knew what her shy looked like, and this was not it. Later that night I went back through my notebook, reading every entry I had written over the past weeks. Each missed visit, each changed plan, each explanation that shifted slightly every time it was repeated. I began to see that the pattern was not random. It was directional. Every path that once led the children toward me now ended somewhere before they reached me. And for the first time I allowed myself to consider something I had been avoiding since this began, that the distance I was feeling was not something happening to me by accident, but something being maintained on purpose by choices I could no longer see directly, only feel the effects of as they quietly accumulated around my life. I stopped trying to convince myself that everything had a simple explanation after the moment I found something I could no longer dismiss as coincidence. It was late in the evening when I was organizing the notebook I had been keeping hidden in my desk drawer, reviewing the entries the way I had begun to do every night, searching for patterns I could not yet fully name. That was when I noticed a small detail I had overlooked before, a message timestamp that did not match what I remembered hearing from Michael. A conversation about Olivia's school schedule had been marked on a day when I had clearly spoken to Samantha directly and been told the children were unavailable due to a family commitment. I remember sitting very still after noticing it, reading the same line over and over again, because it meant that at least one of the explanations I had been given could not be true at the same time as another. The following morning I called Michael again, not with frustration, but with a calmness I had carefully practiced, asking him to clarify something small, something that would not sound like an accusation. I asked him if Olivia's school had recently changed their weekly pickup schedule, because I had received conflicting information. There was a pause on the line that lasted just long enough for me to feel the shift before he even spoke. When he answered, his voice was careful, almost overly structured, and he said that Samantha handled all of those details now, so I should check with her if I needed updates. It was not what he said, but how quickly he redirected me that made something settle in my chest. Later that same week, I received a short video from a family group chat that I had almost been removed from months earlier without explanation. In the video, Olivia was speaking at what looked like a school presentation, reading from a small paper with confidence, and at the end she said thank you to her mother and father for always being there. I watched it several times, not because it was unusual for a child to thank her parents, but because I knew I had been there for almost every step of that journey until recently, and yet my presence was not even indirectly acknowledged. That night I wrote another entry in my notebook, but this time I did not just list events. I began writing questions. Why were visits always redirected at the last moment? Why did conversations about the children always end with Samantha's name? Why did every explanation feel complete when spoken individually, but incomplete when placed next to the others? I remember stopping at one point and looking around my quiet living room, realizing how much of my understanding of my own family now depended on what I was told rather than what I could actually see. The most unsettling part was not that I was being kept at a distance, but that the distance was being maintained so smoothly that it almost felt natural from the outside. And yet inside me, something had already begun to shift, a quiet refusal to accept that so many coincidences could exist in one family without someone guiding them into place. I told myself I would stop looking for patterns that might not exist, but the next incident made that impossible. It happened on a quiet afternoon when I received a notification from the family email thread that I was still technically included in, although no one ever directly addressed me there anymore. The message was about a school event for Ethan, a small award ceremony scheduled for the following Friday at 10 in the morning. I remember staring at it for a long time because I had not been informed about it through any personal message, even though in the past I had always been invited to such events directly by Michael. I decided to reply simply, asking if there was still room for family members to attend. There was no response that day. The following morning, I received a short message from Samantha saying that seating was very limited and already arranged, and that it would be easier for the children if only immediate parents attended. That phrase stayed with me because I had spent years believing that I was immediate family, not something optional or conditional. I did not argue. I simply wrote it down in my notebook like I had begun doing with everything else. On the day of the event, I drove past the school anyway, telling myself I would not go inside, only observe from a distance if possible. The parking lot was already full when I arrived, and I stayed in my car for a long time, watching families walk toward the entrance with flowers and cameras. I saw Michael arrive with Samantha and the children a few minutes later. Olivia was holding her mother's hand, and Ethan was walking slightly ahead, turning back occasionally as if checking for something behind him. I watched carefully, waiting for even the smallest sign that they might look toward my direction, but none came. After the event, I saw a series of photos posted online. In one of them, Ethan was holding a certificate, smiling under bright school lights, while Samantha stood close beside him and Michael placed a hand on his shoulder. I zoomed in on the image longer than I should have, noticing how naturally they all stood together, how complete the picture looked without any obvious gap. I remember feeling something unusual at that moment, not anger or sadness, but a kind of quiet disorientation, as if I was looking at a version of my own family that had been carefully arranged without leaving space for me to exist inside it. That evening I called Michael again. But this time I did not ask about events or schedules. I asked him directly if something had changed in how the children saw me. There was a pause before he answered, and when he did, his tone was slower, more measured, as if he had already prepared for the question. He said nothing had changed, that the children were just adjusting to routines, and that I should not take things personally. But the words did not match what I had been observing for weeks. After the call ended, I opened my notebook again and realized that every entry I had written pointed in the same direction, not toward misunderstanding or chance, but toward a coordinated absence that had been built step by step until it became the only version of reality my family was willing to present to me. I did not plan to confront anything that day, but sometimes truth reveals itself in ways that do not require planning. It began with a phone call that came earlier than usual, not from Michael or Samantha, but from an unknown number that I almost ignored. When I answered, a woman's voice introduced herself as a staff member from Ethan's school office, calling to confirm attendance records for an upcoming parent meeting. She sounded polite, routine, reading from a list, until she paused and asked if I was still listed as an authorized guardian for notifications. That question caught me off guard because I had never been removed from anything officially, at least not that I had been told. I said yes, I believed I still was, and she hesitated before saying that according to their latest update, only Michael and Samantha were listed as primary contacts. I remember sitting very still after that call ended, not because it was shocking in a dramatic way, but because it confirmed something I had been trying not to fully accept. Later that day, I checked my email system again, carefully going through older messages, and I noticed subtle changes I had not paid attention to before. Invitations that once included me directly were now CC'd without personal address. Reminders that used to say grandmother were replaced with family group, and in some cases, my name no longer appeared at all. It was not a single decision, but a gradual editing of presence, as if I had been rewritten out of the margins of my own family. That evening, I decided to visit a place I had not been to in months, a small park near Samantha's neighborhood where I used to take the children when they were younger. I told myself it was coincidence that I ended up there, but I knew I was looking for something I could not yet define. I sat on a bench for nearly an hour, watching other families pass by, children running ahead of parents without hesitation, voices carrying freely in the open air. At one point I saw Samantha's car drive past the entrance road, slow down briefly, then continue without stopping. I did not call out, and I am not even sure she saw me, but the moment passed with a strange stillness that felt heavier than recognition. That night, I returned home and spread everything I had collected across my dining table, my notes, printed messages, screenshots of posts, and appointment confirmations. I read through them slowly, not searching for emotion anymore, but for structure. And for the first time I could clearly see it. The pattern was not just exclusion, it was replacement. Every moment I was removed from was filled immediately by something else, another activity, another explanation, another version of family life that did not require my presence. It was not chaotic or accidental. It was consistent, deliberate in its consistency, and that realization changed something inside me that I could not reverse. I was no longer asking why I felt distant from my family. I was beginning to understand that distance had been carefully maintained long enough to become invisible to everyone except the one person standing outside of it. I stopped trying to convince myself that there was still room for misunderstanding when the final piece of evidence arrived in the most ordinary way possible. It came through a routine school system update email that I almost deleted without reading, but something in the subject line made me pause. It was an automated notification confirming changes to emergency contact priorities for Ethan and Olivia. I opened it without expecting anything unusual, but halfway through the document, I saw my name listed under secondary contact with restricted access. For a moment I thought it must be a system error, because there had never been any conversation, any agreement, any notification that such a change was being made. I checked the date stamp, and it showed the update had been processed 3 weeks earlier. 3 weeks during which I had been calling, messaging, and asking about visits, all while my access had already been quietly reduced without my knowledge. I remember putting the phone down on the table and just sitting there, not reacting at first because part of me was still trying to find a version of the situation where this made sense in a harmless way. That same afternoon, I decided to call the school directly again, this time asking very carefully what had changed and who had authorized it. The response was polite but firm, confirming that only Michael and Samantha had submitted the request, and that it was considered a family decision. The word family felt different when she said it, as if it no longer included me in its definition. After that call ended, I did something I had avoided for a long time. I drove to Michael's house without telling anyone. I did not intend to create confrontation, only clarity. When I arrived, I stayed in the car for several minutes before getting out, watching the curtains move slightly in the front window, as if someone inside had noticed I was there. When Michael finally came outside, he looked surprised but not shocked, like he had been expecting this moment at some point. I asked him directly why I had been removed from the school contact list without being told. He hesitated before answering, and when he did, his voice was careful, almost rehearsed again, saying that it was simply about organization, about reducing confusion for the children, about keeping communication streamlined. I listened without interrupting, but none of those words explained why I had not been informed. I told him I was not confused, I was simply unaware, and there is a difference between the two. He looked away when I said that, as if searching for the right version of the truth that would not cause conflict. Then I asked him if Samantha had been the one coordinating all of this, and he did not answer immediately. That silence told me more than anything he could have said. When he finally spoke, he repeated that Samantha was managing the children's routines because it was easier for everyone. Easier for everyone had become a phrase I was hearing too often to ignore. Before I left, I asked him one final question, whether the children had been told anything about me that I should know. He said they were just adjusting and that I should give them time. But as I drove away from that house, I realized I was no longer waiting for time to fix anything. I was now watching how carefully time was being used to reshape my place inside a family that I had once believed was permanent. I had already begun to accept that answers would not come from being told the truth, but from observing what people chose not to say, and that understanding changed the way I moved through every conversation that followed. A few days after my visit to Michael's house, I received another message from the school system, this time not an update but a summary report of communication preferences. It listed how each child's information was to be shared, who could receive direct notifications, and under what circumstances contact should be escalated. I read it slowly, line by line, until I reached the section that confirmed what I had already begun to suspect. All routine updates about Olivia and Ethan were now filtered exclusively through Michael and Samantha, with no direct notifications sent to me under any circumstance unless manually approved by them. There had been no discussion, no family meeting, no explanation offered to me at any point during this process. It had simply been done, quietly and completely, in a way that left no visible break in the system except for the one I now occupied. That evening, I tried calling Olivia again, not through any official channel, but directly, hoping that at least her voice would remain unchanged. The call did not go through. Instead, I received a brief automated message stating that the number had restricted incoming contact settings. I remember sitting with my phone in my hand for a long time after that, not because I expected immediate access, but because I understood that even informal pathways to my grandchildren were now being controlled in the same structured way as formal ones. Later that night, I went through my notebook again, but this time I was not looking for inconsistencies. I was looking for intention. Every missed visit, every delayed response, every redirected conversation suddenly aligned into a single direction that I could no longer ignore. The pattern was not passive distance. It was active management. Someone was not forgetting to include me. Someone was deciding when and how I should be excluded, and ensuring it happened consistently enough that it appeared natural from the outside. I did not sleep much that night. Instead, I sat in my living room with the lights off, thinking about how long something like this would have to happen before it stopped feeling like an accident and started feeling like a system. The next morning, I drove past Samantha's house again, slower this time, not to observe anything specific, but to confirm that life inside continued without interruption. I saw Olivia briefly through a window, sitting at the kitchen table, her attention focused downward, not looking toward the street. It was a small moment, almost nothing on its own, but it carried the weight of everything that had been building over weeks. And as I drove away, I finally understood that I was no longer dealing with misunderstandings or scheduling conflicts. I was dealing with a structure that had already decided where I belonged and, more importantly, where I did not. I did not realize how quiet everything had become until I reached the point where even silence started to feel organized, as if it had been arranged with intention rather than happening naturally. After days of watching, recording, and rereading every message and every absence, I finally understood that there would be no moment of confession, no sudden explanation that would restore what had been lost. The clarity I had been searching for was not going to be spoken to me. It had already been expressed through every decision that separated me from my grandchildren, one step at a time, until distance became routine and routine became invisible. That morning I sat at my kitchen table with my notebook open in front of me, not writing anything new, just reading the same pages again and again until the pattern no longer felt like something I was trying to solve, but something I was being shown. Every entry pointed in the same direction, not toward misunderstanding but toward choice. A choice repeated often enough to become structure. A structure repeated long enough to become normal. And I realized that what I had been calling confusion was actually the final stage of being quietly removed from a life that continued without me. I did not go to Samantha's house again. I did not call Michael. There was nothing left in those conversations that could change what had already been decided through silence. Instead, I began to accept something I had resisted for a long time, that understanding does not always lead to restoration, sometimes it only leads to recognition. That afternoon I took my notebook and placed it back into the drawer where I had first hidden it, not because I was finished, but because I no longer needed to keep proving to myself what I already knew. The truth had stopped being hidden. It had simply stopped including me. And in that realization there was no confrontation waiting to happen, no final argument to be had. Only the quiet acceptance that a family can continue to exist in full detail, with laughter, schedules, photographs, and memories being created every day, while one person slowly becomes a footnote in it, without ever being told when the transition began. And that's the end of today's story. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more unforgettable stories like this. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.